Live streaming is on.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Event Trader here. Getting into the afternoon hours. We've been pretty much just jostling around that 4880 area going on all day long. And had an interesting conversation with a couple of subs that I keep in close contact with, always giving me good information out there. And one of them was just talking about how few of her clients have been doing anything in the market, really. There's one that hasn't made a trade in 11 days, she was saying. So, kind of highlights some of the backdrop. And then my other guy, he's always keeping me in tuned on the options. And I know Brandon's spoken with him, really on top of his game there. And it's just been real interesting to see how much options trading has dominated the overall indice action over the last 2 weeks, really. So we'll bring in options trader Brandon Mars, and I'll pose that question to him in terms of Brandon. With your thoughts on the market, have you been paying a lot of attention to the indice options and just kind of following along?
Gavin, to be honest with you, I talked about this a little bit before. I haven't taken a look at a ton of the index options. To be honest with you, I think I get kind of caught up going down a little bit of a rabbit hole looking at so many of the options chains of the big tech companies and my common traders, if you will. So I've kind of been focusing there, but I guess I got my homework for tonight to take a look and see if anything's jumping out at me now that you mention it.
Well, I mean, it's funny because like some of the people that I've been talking to, they just really mention how a lot of the instruments that we're used to reading here, the VIX and the put call ratio, the 0 days to expiration options have really just kind of made those instruments, I don't want to call it irrelevant by any stretch of the imagination, but tougher reads because there's so much volume going into those 0 DTEs that it's disrupting it. Is that something that you've noticed on your end of the trading spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, those 0 DTEs, I know we've talked about it on this call before, and you and I have talked about it offline a couple of times. I mean, they just keep growing and growing. And I had mentioned this in my notes. Geez, this was probably like a couple months ago, but I think there was like 7 new ETFs. I think like the XLE was one of them. I might be wrong on that. The XLT, is that the 10-year ETF, I think, TLT or whatever the
TNX
ticker
would
is.
be the 10 year. Or
Okay.
actually, no, you could be right on. What TLT is the 20 year, IEF is the 7 to 10 year, I believe, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. So yeah, I mean, again, just more instruments getting more and more of these 0 DTEs, and I haven't looked yet, or I have looked, but I haven't seen any yet on the new Bitcoin ETFs. IBIT doesn't seem to have any options yet, but it'll be interesting to see if those start rolling out any sort of 0 DTEs too, and make the good old crypto world an even bigger Wild West.
Well, what's the rule of thumb for equities? In terms of a new IPO getting options, isn't it 2 or 3 weeks needs to be established before options can go into play?
I think it's 5 trading days.
Is it only five
Um,
trading days? Okay, I thought it
yeah,
might
I
have been
think
longer than
so.
that.
Again, that's one that I'm not 100% on because I just haven't followed it closely, but I believe it's only like 5 trading days. And I think the last time we had a situation with an IPO, you and I were talking about one of the recent IPOs last year, and I was keeping an eye on that. And I want to say it was 5 days, but still nothing on IBIT.
All right, somebody's telling me that for an ETF, it has to be 90 days
Oh,
before
okay.
options are put out. And bigger instruments, right? So that probably makes sense, I suppose. But yeah, so we'll keep an eye out on those Bitcoin ones because it's obvious that these are pretty popular trading vehicles for traders, and for me, it's making my life a little tougher trying to figure out exactly what's going on when I'm looking at the VIX because seen a lot of VIX call option activity going on over the last week or two, But then, you take a look at the SVXY, which is the short VIX ETF, or take a look at the VIX itself or the put call ratios, none of them have really been flagging any sort of concern out in the markets. So just been an interesting backdrop, and really just kind of goes to show how much those options trades have been dominating everything there. So, just something that we'll continue to try to flesh out as we move along. So, Brandon, let's talk about your thoughts on the broader market here, and kind of what you're seeing out there in the indices. Is there any indice that's jumping out to you, or any sectors for that matter jumping out to you?
Yeah, I'll kind of repeat what I put in my morning notes yesterday. I mean, for me, my thoughts right now are pretty simple. Markets are breaking out and they're strong, so I'm just trying to find call opportunities. Obviously we saw a little bit of a fade yesterday, created a little bit of a shooting star candle on the S&P and the NASDAQ futures. So it's just a little something to be mindful of. But, we made a strong breakout, and, all the moving averages are kind of moving the way that we want them to. And we got stocks above their 20 days and the moving averages above their 20 days. So, for me, and, if I don't know, if Netflix comes along and throws a big curveball, that might be something. There's obviously some geopolitical headlines. We have seen a little bit of an uptick in rates, which is always something to be mindful of. But, until there's a big major shift for me, this is just one of those periods where I'm just trying to find calls. We've obviously got some pretty extended stocks out there here and there. Something like an AMD took a nice little pretty near parabolic move. Things like that you got to be mindful of. But, just trying to find stocks that aren't super extended, or, might be some catch-up names. But, I've talked about this before. This is just one of those environments where it's just a little bit easier for me to just try to go out and find calls versus, looking at both my put and call list on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. No, it's always good to try to just kind of keep yourself focused in one area of the market, I find, for sure. Uh, and with that in mind, we're going to just kind of take a look at some of your recent trades, and we're just going to go in reverse chronological order from what you've posted about this week and what you've traded. And you just opened up a trade buying the Adobe Friday 610 calls. Now, anybody that follows Brandon knows that he had a 110% winner last week in Adobe. So definitely want to sit up and pay attention to what Brandon has to say about this. But what's going on in Adobe that caught your attention? And just what from last week did you use to kind of infer what's going to go on in Adobe in the next couple of days?
I never thought that hearing about 110% return would sting, but after the move that Adobe made after I got out of it last week, that one stung a little bit. I think it moved another 13 to 15 points after I got out. So I mentioned this in my notes on Friday. I hope somebody ignored me and rode that one till the end of the day. But yeah, Adobe went onto my radar last week. Just real nice move with the rest of the market on Friday, but it made a really nice candle, little wick at the top, and it was on some pretty decent volume for Adobe too. And it hadn't quite hit its upper Bollinger Band, which a lot of stocks had after Friday. So just thought with the no wick at the top on the volume and where it stood, that it might have some more room to run. And I'll go a little bit further into this when we get into our topic too, but had a gap to fill up around 618. So, it closed right around 611 and a half. So, at that point seemed like that gap might kind of act like the magnet and draw it in. And, it sure did. And, made a nice gap up yesterday. And then kind of once it hit that and filled that gap, it faded all day. But put it on my radar, and I had it on my watch list today. I didn't post it in the room, but it was on, my side list that I keep, and made a real nice bounce off of the lows this morning and kind of created a little bit of a flag pattern. the flag pattern started to consolidate on the volume, which again, you want to see some lower volume there on the selling side versus the buying side. And then just kind of started to actually see some increased volume start to come in on it on the buying side. And it's just been kind of coiling around the 600, the key 600 level. So I think that also coincides with, I believe it's the 50-day. Yes, the 50-day is also right around the 600 level. So, again, just looking for that to hopefully consolidate around there and make a move higher above that 50-day, and hopefully start going to test like the 605, the 610 area. With the choppiness today, I'd probably be happy if it moved up to 605 and look to potentially exit unless it was looking real strong.
All right, so we'll keep an eye out on that. Is there anything that would be a red flag that would get you out of the trade today?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of dipping back down towards that 595 area. That's probably an area I'll probably keep an eye on. That might be a little bit of a red flag for me. It actually kind of created a little bit of a triangle right around the 600 level. It's dipping down now, which is as painful as it is to see the red come into it. I actually kind of like that because sometimes those can create head fakes. So, the pullback here that it's seeing right now is kind of on some light volume. So as long as that doesn't pick up and it doesn't break down too much further, I'll still like the trade.
All right, so we'll keep an eye out on Adobe. Another one that you took today, you've already banked part of it. I believe you're still in ROKU, right?
Partially, yes.
Partially, yeah, after banking some. So for another nice profit there. So what was it in ROKU that was sticking out to you?
Yeah, I figured with the whole Netflix WWE deal this morning, maybe the TV world would get excited and ROKU would see a bounce. So I'm kidding about that, but I actually do think it could actually be giving it a little bit of a boost to the overall sector. But had this one on my radar this morning. I mentioned it in my notes this morning. So, one, you do have the Netflix earnings coming up. So, ROKU can always be a potential play around that. There's more risk, but it is definitely a stock to play around Netflix. And kind of thought that this one was a little bit of a catch-up candidate. Again, trying to find the stocks that aren't super extended. And yesterday it made a pretty nice move and started to test that 20-day moving average and really the downtrend that it's been in since roughly the end of November. So between all those things, you got the MACD that's looking like it's about to make a bullish cross actually today. It's got a divergence on the RSI. Testing that 20-day again. And, again, I'm not a big news trader. I'm more of a chart guy, but I did see the Netflix WWE thing. And I was like, all right, well, between that and Netflix earnings, maybe the whole kind of entertainment sector sees a little enthusiasm to it. And I mainly like the chart going into the day. So, jumped on it and took a little bit of profit around a little under 50%. And he wanted to just kind of lock in profit on ROKU in particular, because it can be a pretty whippy stock. So locked in a little bit of profit there. And, it's starting to make a little bit of a move higher again. It's seen a couple of candles here that have had some decent volume coming into them. So kind of intrigued there. That we could hopefully, I'm hoping for today, go and test the highs of yesterday around the 91.5 area. That's kind of my target for right now. If things got really strong, you could be looking at a move to the 50-day, but not sure I'll push it that much, especially with Netflix earnings coming up.
All right. Yeah, and out of curiosity, ROKU's not one of your usual names, right? I know you did put it on the radar on Monday morning, but is that a new one for you? I know you usually kind of keep to like 30 names.
ROKU is actually one that I look at on a regular basis, but don't trade frequently. So you're absolutely correct there. I think this is maybe the I don't know, second or third ROKU trade I've thrown out in the past year. So yeah, you're exactly correct. Not a major trader for me, but I kind of put that in my bucket of, those high growth, whippy stocks to look at, when we get those days of like, I don't know, post Fed, let's say, where, the Fed's giving us the all clear on the interest rates, and you get those, tech stocks like Roku or Snowflake that tend to make the big moves. I kind of have it on my list for that. And I actually like trading it. It just can get super, super whippy. So I try to be a little bit more selective on when I enter into that name in particular.
All right. You also threw Roblox on. You said you're going to keep an eye on it as a possible catch-up name, another one for some call opportunities. You said you'd especially be interested if it could get above the 50-day around 41.14. And here we take a look at it. It is trading at 40.83. So it doesn't quite hit that target yet that you're looking for.
Yeah, and this will probably be a good one for us to maybe circle back about on our topic today too. Yeah, like you said, just looking for the catch-up names. I had a pretty solid day yesterday. Didn't have too much of a fade, so got a little bit of a wick at the top of the candle, but started to test that 50-day. Seemed like if it could test the 50-day and maybe get above it, then the 20-day would be in sight. It actually did both of those things, but it all happened within the first, 15 minutes of the day. And then it's just faded since then. So, again, I don't trade a ton during the first 30. Roku today was during the first 30 just because I saw an opportunity. And for Roblox, unfortunately, if you had taken some calls overnight, would have been a great trade, but you just kind of hit some of those moving averages and has faded. At this point too, I mean, we still got some trading left, but it's kind of forming a little bit of a shooting star type candle on the daily chart. So, if it can close above the 50, that might be intriguing. But it looks like it has the potential at this point to maybe move back down. But again, if the market's strong, this is a stock that's not super extended. It could just kind of see a natural lift. But kind of have this one off the radar for the time being.
All right. And then the last one you had thrown on your radar was actually a put idea, just in case anything rolled over, and that would have been PepsiCo, PEP. Now, this was based off of Procter and Gamble and kind of how their earnings would go. Two best performing groups, and this will also help segue into our discussion for gaps. PG, number 2 in the Dow 30, up 4.6%. Verizon, of course, also reported earnings up 5.8. Worst performer for that matter is 3M, down 11% on the session. So all earnings gappers. But you did have Pepsi as a sympathy play around Procter and Gamble. So PG, obviously, good day. So did that take your eyes right off that Pepsi put idea, or how are you kind of approaching that?
Yeah, I took that trade idea off in about 2 seconds. Like I mentioned in my notes, that would strictly be something to look at if Procter and Gamble brought down the sector. Clearly, they have not done that. Real nice move for a blue chip. Pretty much the complete opposite of 3M. That would have been a nice put to take into earnings, that's for sure, because that's a heck of a move for a blue chip. But
well, they're interesting. I talked about it earlier today too, Brandon. Where if you pay attention to 3M, if they miss earnings, they have an abysmal performance. So hopefully people stayed away from that or gotten short from me and Jim's discussion around that. But 3M's an interesting case for the blue chippers, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely quite the move, and yeah, you were pretty spot on with your comments on that one. That's for sure. But yeah, just to wrap up Pepsi here real quick. I mean, what I did like about it, just for what this is worth, is if you look at that over, I don't know, call it the last week and a half, it's just been hanging out around that 165 area. It tested it really a bunch between, November and December. And then over the last week and a half, I mean, just really has not participated at all in the stock rally of the overall indexes. And, if it's hanging out there and, showing that weakness, sometimes it just needs a little push over the edge for a breakdown. So, in theory, if Procter and Gamble had, gone in the opposite direction, which again was totally the play that I would be, looking at this particular trade. And if not, it's kind of null and void for me. So, if it had gone in the other direction, you would think that this would have really dragged down Pepsi. But, anytime that something in the sector is going up, 4.5%, 5%, not necessarily something I want to bet against. So off the radar.
All right. So we will get now into our earnings discussion, which obviously a good segue given the commentary that we've just had. Just keeping an eye out on this market, Brandon. We got up to 48.86 there in the S&P futures. Running in a little bit of a pullback here on some volume. Let me just do a quick headline check there. And nothing's jumping off the page. And that's so I see Bullard speaking, but obviously he's a former St. Louis Fed president. But okay. So let's break into the topic, Brandon, right? And we're going to be talking about gapping plays around earnings. And Brandon's going to give you a few thoughts on how to play it. Now, I know, Brandon, we've talked a lot about this in the past. The implied volatility discussion from last week. If anybody had missed that, you could circle back. We were able to find that recording, luckily enough, and posted that on Thursday. So, kind of went through some of the different characteristics of that going into earnings and, what it implies for a stock. Now, Brandon, I know you usually don't like to trade stocks too close to the to earnings. Number one, the premium's very expensive. The volatility there can be a difficult read, and they call it an earnings surprise for a reason, right? So why don't you start going off some of your talking points that you wanted to discuss going around this very topic?
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, there might be some repeats in here, so I apologize for that. But the reason that I thought this might be timely is, like you said, we're getting into the earnings season where we're going to start to see this more and more. But also what I was seeing it on was some stocks like an AMD, where you're getting those gap ups and fades just because of where we are in the markets. So just thought it might be a timely session, and we might be talking maybe a little bit more here technicals than options on this one. So hopefully everyone's okay with that one. But I mean, like I was just saying, as we get into earnings, especially when we start getting into the big tech names like Netflix today, we'll start to see these more and more. So this doesn't always happen, but there are a lot of times that, these stocks will either, gap up or gap down, and they draw people in. And part of the reason that they do that is they want this thing to gap up. They want you to jump into those calls, and then they want to either fade it so they can, kill that call premium, or they want it to trade sideways so, they can just have it kind of chop and eat away at your premium. And it can be very easy to get drawn into, a good report or news when you find those stocks that just run and run. It's great, but it can get pretty frustrating when you get stuck in some of those sideways trades. And, I think right now, and part of the reason that I thought this might be timely right now is, as far as where some of the stocks are, as far as their RSI, or I've mentioned the Bollinger Bands a couple of times, it could take some strong reports for them to run all day. So I personally just think that in a couple of cases, we might be a little bit more susceptible to some of that sideways trade. For something like, AMD, it's a great stock. I mean, it's done great. I'm not saying go and sell it, any of that. I'm not saying go and bet against it, but that has had a very big move with some very high expectations. And one would just think from an options perspective that in order for it to, continue on higher that day in particular, to have it just run all day after the open, that it would need a pretty strong report. So,
Brandon, let me ask you that. I know obviously you were mentioning RSI, so is that kind of like your quick go-to if you're just looking at a stock that's about to report earnings?
Yeah, I mean, RSI is one that I keep on my daily chart. I love to play, the 50 RSI bounce or 50 RSI rejection, and I just
Well,
keep.
that's what I was going to ask you, because I mean I know 70 is generally, once it's over 70 it's overbought, right? But like is there a level that kind of is a red flag for you that doesn't necessarily have to be 70 or anything along those lines? How do you kind of look at the RSI and then extrapolate that into earnings expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I keep the pretty basic, the 30-70 as kind of my rule of thumb. For me though, I don't necessarily let that, I don't let it keep me out of a trade per se, especially in an environment like this, because some of these stocks are just going to run and run and run as an oversold condition for a long time. So if something is like super extended up in like the 80, 85 range, it's up at the top of its Bollinger Band. Yeah, for me, that just kind of scares me away from an earnings perspective. And again, it's like you said, I don't trade earnings very often. And um, you know, I I don't know. I just don't do it for that very reason. Cause like you said, it is an earnings surprise. But yeah, if something's up at the very top of its upper Bollinger Band and it's like an 85 RSI, if you go and look at the options chain, you're going to have, again, that high premium that we've talked about, and you're probably going to need a very big move for that stock. So for me, it's just not worth the risk return.
Okay. So okay, so we got the stock going into earnings. What are some of the other elements that you're watching here in addition to the RSI?
Yeah. So, one thing I wanted to talk about, circling back to Adobe here. So, in a case like that, I mentioned in my notes, I was looking for Adobe, had that nice green candle, had that gap to fill. So what I would look for is, those different levels. If you're sitting there post earnings, like you just asked about, and, Adobe's got that, gap to fill at the 618 level. Well, if all of a sudden it just gaps up to that level right away, and it's some sort of key, moving average, resistance, Fibonacci level, that's where I look for, a potential red flag, really. And again, not necessarily saying to, go out and sell the thing by any means, but, if it gaps up to that level post earnings, it is something to be mindful of, to watch for a potential fade. So those are kind of some of the things that I look for. If we're entering into an earnings play, and we've got, say, Netflix, and I'm just making this up, say Netflix had 5 different moving averages above the price, that's something I'd be mindful of. That's going to be, create a potential ceiling. And again, if Netflix kills it, it will just blow right through all those. But those are going to be different resistance points. And again, when you're trading options, you want to have kind of as much leeway to the upside and the downside to hit those breakouts. And, any sort of, ceiling or floor when it comes to options is always something that I'm mindful of.
All right. You mentioned Bollinger Bands too in your comments. So, um, when you're looking at Bollinger Bands, you got your moving averages. Is that what you're basically looking at for strike prices in terms of where you might be interested in playing something?
Yeah, that's usually what I would look at. Yeah, we'll use ROKU, for example. At the time it was was trading right around, a little bit under the 90 area. So at that point, a stock like a Roku, a 3-point move on a breakout would be pretty reasonable. So, I didn't want to do 90 because that would be, just right at the money. And, again, there's nothing wrong with that. I just tend to go a couple steps out of the money in anticipation of a breakout. And then you had the 50-day moving average up around 93.71. So when I looked at the options chain this morning, at least when I went into it, I'm sure it's changed now. One of the strikes with the highest amount of volume was the 93. So I'm sitting there telling myself, all right, well, if this thing does break out over 90, it gets back over that 20-day moving average and it makes a real nice move. The 50-day would probably potentially cap that move for the day. 93 has the most volume on it. So that's where I picked my particular strike.
Okay. Makes sense. All right. So just kind of going along in your notes here. You talk about the Adobe call, but then you go on to talk about some of the gaps following it. So what are some of the things that you're typically looking for in a gap, either in the fade or in the bounce or just flatlining? Do you have any sort of preference where you wait a certain amount of days or anything along those lines?
I mean, for me, as far as the fade goes, one of the reasons that I like to take profits if I do take options overnight, and I've talked about this a bunch of times, if I get a gap that moves in my favor at the open, I like to lock in those profits, get the day off to a good start. Adobe was a great example yesterday. I mean, it gapped right up to my resistance level and, it faded. It would have been a great put, actually. I just wasn't looking at puts, so I would have totally missed that one. But definitely one of the reasons that I like to lock in, my profits right out of the gate. Again, I hate ruining my day in the first, 30 minutes of the day. So yeah, no particular time frame or anything. It's more of have we hit our levels? If something again with the Bollinger Band is super extended, you got to really be careful of those gap up and fades. AMD recently was a great example. They kind of draw you in, making you think it's going to make yet another high. You jump into calls right away, and then they just fade the stock the rest of the day. And after the move it's had, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing that eventually you're going to get some of that profit taking to kick in.
Okay. So you say that you usually start looking for these opportunities in the last hour of every trading day. So why don't you take us through kind of how you're looking at things, where you're finding opportunities following earnings or going into earnings? Do you have your list of 30 that you just kind of track when their earnings dates are and pay attention to them around those dates?
Yeah, so I'm always watching those around the dates. And again, we talked about this last week. One of the big keys, if you don't have a calendar right in front of you, is if all of a sudden you see the implied volatility on a stock, double, triple what it usually is. That's usually a good indicator that, there might be some sort of an event like earnings right now. So just take your extra caution. But yeah, I usually start looking for these opportunities, within the last hour of trading. I run through my list every single day in the last hour. I'm looking at the daily charts. What do the candles look like? What do the volumes look like? Is it approaching any of those moving averages? Has it, broken above any that I was watching? And, in these times right now of the high momentum, I do love to find the candles that have no wick at the top. So if I think that we're going to get any sort of second day follow through momentum, I love to find when there's no wick at the top on some good volume and, again, maybe some runway. It doesn't have any moving averages within, 4 or 5 points, something like that. So, A good example again would have been AMD recently. It had the candle that I would look for on a Friday, but it's Bollinger Bands. It was just way above it, and for me, that just becomes a null and void. Sometimes I miss those opportunities, unfortunately, because I take it off of my lists. But really looking for something that's got a little bit of room to run on a day two.
Okay. Let's see. So you definitely never force these trades, right? You're always kind of waiting for things to shake out a little bit before you try jumping in, going for those nice singles and doubles rather than trying to hit the home runs. But what are the things that you mentioned that perhaps people wouldn't be paying as much attention to would be economic reports being released the next day that could impact things. So, kind of do you have set yourself out a checklist if you're looking at a trade like this just to make sure that you haven't left any stone unturned?
Yeah, like you said, I mean, the economic reports, I think it's very easy for us to just kind of get caught up in the daily candles, watching the green and the red move all day, and you're looking at your daily charts of your different stocks. I think sometimes, if we don't have one of those huge reports that we've been talking about for a week that we're in anticipation of, I think it sometimes can be easy that at 8:30 the next morning something's coming out that could move the markets and affect that overnight trade. So, for me, kind of my checklist would be looking at those economic reports, and then it's also looking at the daily charts of the indexes. You could have a particular stock that looks great at the end of the day, and in this environment, there's a good chance it could get that follow through. But if all of a sudden the indexes have this huge glaring like textbook reversal candle on it, maybe I don't want to take calls overnight on that just in case, even though it should maybe still see that follow through momentum. So it comes down to the economic reports, the daily charts on the indexes, and then the daily chart on the individual name. And you're spot on. There's no reason to force these things. There's a lot of times at 3:30 where I kind of sit and I go back and forth, and I'm like, oh, this looks good. I like it. If I got the gap up, this could be a nice move. But unless I'm really feeling very confident about the overnight trade, I'm not necessarily going to add it because there's like an Adobe trade that I just mentioned, really that only time to buy the calls that day was if you took the calls over the weekend, which I just personally wasn't interested in because it was the weekend. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's anything wrong to ever just hold off and revisit in the morning.
That's interesting. Let me ask you, does the day the company report have a big impact on how you'd be looking at things? I.e., Apple and Amazon and Meta are out next Thursday, as opposed to Netflix, which is out obviously tonight on a Tuesday. Does that factor in?
It can, because I think Thursday in particular, I think gives you an opportunity for some lotto options into Friday. Again, your premiums are going to be very high on those names. You will get some elevated premiums on the QQQ just because there's so many big names that are reporting in that one day. So, your premiums are going to be driven up a little bit. But, if you get down to and I guess you got the 0 DTEs on QQQ, so it doesn't really matter what day of the week it is. But if you were playing something else and you're playing a Friday expiration, you could find some sort of side play, if you will, like, for example, Roku off of a Netflix, if it were on a Friday, and you could get into those options a little bit cheaper because you've only got one day. So I think I'm a little bit more prone to taking something on a Thursday evening, just because it does give you that shot for a home run, and you can always put in less capital in that particular case because you are treating it as a lotto. So a little bit on the day of the week for sure.
All right. Let's see. I'm trying to think if I got any other questions for you on this particular topic. I guess the simple one is, what would be your thoughts? Not asking you to make a call or a trade on Netflix going in, because I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in that. And then the follow up to that will be: are there any names that you kind of watching this week for potential opportunities that we haven't discussed yet?
Let's see, Netflix. Let's just take a quick look here at the options chain while we're at it, just to see if there's anything glaring out there. A little bit heavier on the put side of things today. That's always interesting on a big tech name.
That would kind of go into your RSI discussion, right? I mean, I haven't checked its RSI, but I know that the whisper numbers for its subscriber figures, so that their guidance is for around 8.8 million, but the whisper numbers is running around 10 to 11 million. So I guess that would factor into that RSI discussion that you were talking about before, right?
I mean, RSI on Netflix on the
Let's see.
daily chart, you're looking just over 57. So
That's not bad.
yeah, compared to a lot of other stocks out there right now, that seems pretty reasonable. You know, from a chart perspective, kind of interesting. Kind of went up and hit that 500 level mid-December, came down, made a higher low, attacked it again, made a higher low over the last week. And it's not too far off the 500 level, and kind of grinding higher. So from a chart perspective, if this didn't have earnings, I'd actually like the setup as a potential run back up to that 500 level.
I was going to say it does look like a good looking chart on that from that perspective. A lot of red bars would have me a little nervous on the volume.
Yeah, definitely a lot of red bars on some pretty decent volume, actually. That's a good catch there. Yeah, that's interesting. But for the way I also maybe look at that too, that I find interesting is, it hasn't moved down a ton off of that big volume.
Right.
So, are they in there trying to buy at 480, thinking that after earnings they're going to shoot it to 550? But yeah, no, that's definitely been some pretty heavy volume, and it really hasn't seen a huge pullback on it, though.
No, let me ask you this. Let's say slightly better than expected report, beating subs, little bottom line beat, decent outlook, decent revs, pulls back down to the 50. Would that fall onto your radar for tomorrow? Because you got the 50 down there. You also got the lower end of the Bollinger Band around 469. So would that be something that would intrigue you in that scenario? Assuming the market stays relatively in similar choppy fashion.
Yeah, I do think that would create an interesting opportunity. Again, as long as the report didn't set off any, red flags, and they were to bring it down to that level. Again, what I would look for, I've talked about this a bunch, so sorry to repeat, but, if it came down to a level like that and you see some sort of big hammer candle, inverted hammer on high volume, and it holds that level, that's what would get me intrigued. But this is an interesting setup, I think. I mean, I think from this setup, as long as they have a pretty decent report, it's not overbought. I have no idea, because I'm a chart guy. I have no idea what the fundamentals are as far as their, EPS. I don't know if they look good, bad, or ugly right now, just for my full disclosure. But from a chart perspective, I'd say any sort of decent report, this thing could get some legs over 500, I would think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, all right. Well, we got about an hour and 45 minutes to see if that comes to fruition, right? So, all right, Brandon.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Let me ask you, any other ideas on this topic that you wanted to touch upon that we didn't have a chance to talk about?
No, I guess the only other thing, you mentioned any others this week. I mean, Tesla, obviously, not to point out the obvious of the big ones out there, but
So Tesla, obviously, a
You
whole
missed it.
different animal from Netflix in terms of expectation. What's Tesla's RSI at here? It's got
I
to be
mean,
close to
Tesla
40, I would
is
think, at least.
it's below 30.
Is it below 30? Yeah, 27. Wow.
Yeah, so
That's down.
we're looking at an oversold Tesla, but I don't know. Looking at that from a chart perspective, that 200 area just seems way too close to the current price, and it has just not seen any sort of participation in this rally. So I had to do a deep dive on this one for my dad the other day because he's been a longtime Tesla shareholder, and he was saying, "What's going on? Where's the bottom?" And I said, "Well, might
You
not
could
like
ask
my
that
answer."
about you could ask about that about a lot of the EV plays here. It's just been a terrible space. Yeah, Rivian.
Yeah, no, it has. So I think that one will be,
But I'll tell
obviously
you one
interesting.
thing, I'll tell you one thing, Brandon, on that topic. Look at Plug today. This is after abysmal guidance. Look at that move. Nice little pop and PLUG getting up to that 20 and 50. So, a little bit of oversold action. And this follows really bad guidance. I think they got guided for revs at 200 million and the consensus was around 357. So when you see a move like that, are you extrapolating anything there towards Tesla?
More so the market of it's a good time to stay long because we've seen these environments before, and I know you've talked about them a bunch on audio where you can just come out with a terrible report and you're up 35% and everybody's buying calls on it. So I think it more so speaks volumes towards maybe the overall market, but yeah, and I mean, I guess seeing that too would maybe think that Tesla is obviously a much better company than Plug. No, no offense to Plug, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if this kind of makes a move off of that, then that actually kind of intrigues me a little bit on the Tesla front, as you mentioned it.
All right. Any other names that you want to touch upon?
No, I think that's it. I'm just looking forward to your notes. Your notes are always very concise, and I like them. And it's actually made me more of a fundamental guy than I ever have been in my life. So thank you for that, and I'll be patiently waiting to hear your thoughts on Netflix.
All right. Well, we'll be getting that in about 2 hours time here and when they're posting their numbers here. But hey, Brandon, as per usual, always a pleasure speaking with you and getting your thoughts on these trades. I know the subscriber base has been very happy with your calls. Just continually hitting on those nice plays. So appreciate that as well. So we'll let you get back to business there and see what else you could unearth from the trading scrap pile. And we'll be talking to you next week.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, man. Take care. All right, I'm going to be shutting down audio temporarily here. We'll be back up in a few. And if anybody had any questions, we will be posting the replay. Hopefully this time the taping worked, but we'll be posting that shortly. And if anybody missed last week's, again, I did end up posting that on Thursday under the Audio X ticker. So if you have any questions on that, definitely feel free to write it and let me know. So we'll be back on the air here in about 10 minutes.